You can now download a free PDF copy or purchase a beautiful printed edition of issue 5 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Christopher Naughton. I'm proud to be working alongside longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove and co-host Divisiveness. Quick note right here at the top. Please click on like, comment, or subscribe. It helps get programs like these out to people like you. So what is the nature of channeling? You might be surprised. My guest today is Dr. Helené Wahbeh in a larger series, a 4-part series known as You Say You Want a Revolution in Consciousness. Here's my interview with Dr. Helené Wahbeh.
Wonderful to be here with you today. Thanks so much for inviting me to be in this conversation, an important conversation for sure.
It really is. And thank you for being here. And again, just a little bit about, we didn't even really get a chance to officially introduce Dr. Helené Wahbeh, but she is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS. She's an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. She is clinically trained as a naturopathic physician. The Science of Channeling is her most recent book, and recent articles on where science and spirituality meet, and more recent on collective consciousness and our sense of interconnectedness, also authored by her. Dr. Wahbeh, thank you for joining us tonight. For those of us old enough to remember that picture of the Earth from outer space, this was taken as the astronauts returned from the moon. And Edgar Mitchell, the man who actually started the Institute of Noetic Sciences, I don't think maybe not everyone knows this. He was the 6th man to walk on the moon, and he has an epiphany on the way back from the moon, does he not?
He does. He had this amazing experience. He's trained as an engineer and became an astronaut, went to the moon, which is incredible in and of itself, did his job on the moon. And then as he was coming home, he was in his capsule and the capsule was spinning, and he would see the sun, the stars, the earth. And he had this incredible transcendent experience where he felt completely at one with everything, and that everything was one with him as well. Now, as an engineer, this was completely foreign to him, this experience that was so visceral. And he came back to Earth and said, I want to know what that is all about, and started the Institute of Noetic Sciences 50 years later. I can't believe it's been 50 years this next year. We have been studying the science of interconnectedness, how we are all connected, and more recently about consciousness and how our consciousness is non-local and is part of this interconnectedness as well.
You know, we tackled this last fall when we were talking about the one mind and all the fruits of the one mind, and how, and of course we worked with Doctors Tucker and Grayson from the University of Virginia, which is just in our backyard, more or less. And they're talking about non-local consciousness. I've got to think that even though there's lots of pushback, and I want you to tell 1 or 2 stories from your book, but I've got to think that this is narrowing that now really serious scientific researchers, maybe not the John Olivers of the world, and maybe some of the other pundits or the amazing Randys, although he's passed on. But I have to think the serious scientists are looking at this seriously.
I believe they are, this concept of non-local consciousness. So in the past, we've been in this paradigm, what you might call materialism. So everything that exists is material, is a physical substance, substrate, and everything that is not physical is essentially impossible. So these experiences that so many people have that go outside of those physical boundaries are either a hallucination or fraud or some other explanation. So now there's many scientists from many different disciplines, physics, cosmology, philosophers are looking at this concept of post-materialism, which includes non-local consciousness. So what does that mean exactly? Traditionally, in a materialistic worldview, our consciousness is limited to our physical brain. Our neurons create our consciousness, and that's where they're housed and that's where they stay. In a post-materialist worldview, our consciousness extends beyond our physical brain, extends beyond time, beyond space, and has the capacity to access, perceive, receive information from beyond just our physical body. So this really does open the door. It has extended beyond the spiritual into the scientific, where we are gaining more evidence that this may, in fact, have some validity.
How many years have you been with IONS now?
7 years.
Okay, so a mere 7 years ago, I think you're seated at a dinner with others, and you tell them that you're going to go ahead and serve at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and someone said, this can hurt your career.
Yes. In fact, the statement was much more severe than that. They said, this is going to kill your academic career, right? And I was taken aback because it was such a dramatic statement. And I took a deep breath and I said, well, if that's so, that's okay, because I'm really not willing to continue doing the research that omits such a huge part of what I believe is at play in our human experience.
Now, you wrote the book, Against the Science of Channeling, great book, and I recommend people pick it up. But when you talk about channeling, we think about channeling, and again, Edgar Cayce was just in our backyard many years ago, but we're right next to Virginia Beach, so Cayce does have some presence here. When I think of channelers, I think of a medium or someone elevated like a Mr. Cayce who is tapping into the Akashic Records or his highest self, etc. Your use of the word channeling, at least in your book, seems to be a catch-all for any of the, what we would call psi phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, intuition, mediumship, etc. Is that accurate?
Yes, you just gave a beautiful description. So I do use a broader umbrella term definition for channeling that does include all of those. And so I'm proposing that all humans have the capacity to channel in one way or another, and that the way it shows up for them is unique. And the way it shows up is on this spectrum, from things like gut hunches or intuitive hits that just about anyone could say that they've experienced at some part in their life, to things like mediumship or trance channeling, which is a term many people associate with the word channeling. So trance channeling is a subcategory of this broader umbrella term that I'm calling channeling.
But you come by channeling honestly as well, because both your grandmother and your mother were channels, correct?
That's right. That's right. They were both trance channels.
And wasn't there an incident once where after your grandmother had passed on, your mother channeled your grandmother and she divulged or shared information that only you and your grandma knew?
Yes, it's really quite an interesting story. My grandmother was in the hospital and I was having a private conversation with her. And she was expressing her concern about passing on, because while she loved my grandfather in life, her religious belief was that she was going to be married to him for eternity. And she wasn't that excited about passing on to be married to him for eternity. So this was a fear that was blocking her from leaving her body. So I, was as loving and kind as I could be as she was sharing that and just trying to nurture and support her. So later, after she did pass, it was probably a few months later, my mother, I believe, channeled my grandmother, and she started laughing and said, I was totally wrong. I don't have to be married to him for eternity. I see him here or there, but he's doing his thing and I'm doing mine.
So there you go. So there's a practical application of channeling. There you go. Not just what I should eat today or what I'm going to be doing in my next lifetime or what have you. But again, what's kind of interesting is now you work for IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, and you folks take a very rigorous science approach to this phenomenon. In fact, I think you're the director of research, not just overall, but when it comes to channeling, don't you do the research regarding that as well?
Yes, so I'm the director of research of our wonderful multidisciplinary team. And I had most of the channeling studies because it is in my personal expertise, personal interest, and scientific background.
Right. So and again, we'll get on to some of the other things that IONS does, but I've got to drill down just a little bit, because even though we feel hopeful that science is at least entertaining this, again, science doesn't have to prove that channeling is dispositive tomorrow. It's demonstrably true. We know it as a scientific fact. Just the fact that they're open to it as a phenomenon. And apparently, didn't IONS submit 2 papers for peer review, which were really, you folks put so much work into it, and you wanted to have them perform peer review, these 2 esteemed journals. And apparently they said channeling does not occur, neither do pigs fly. Tell us about that.
So, I talked about these paradigms, the materialist and the post-materialist. We really have one foot in both. And so it's this incredible transition where we're running against so many obstacles. Now, the gold standard in science and academia is to submit your work to what's called a peer review. And then your peers review it, they give you constructive criticism, improve it, etc. So when we submitted this to a journal, it was actually a very benign study. That one was on meditators, and it was asking meditators if they had any channeling type experiences during channeling or around their channeling practice. And many of them said yes, like telepathic experiences with their teachers, seeing non-physical beings around them, etc. But the topic was pretty benign. And the editor wrote this like 2-page vehement, angry email saying, not only am I rejecting this, but I'm going to actively work on preventing any study like this from ever being published. And your research question is not one that you should even be asking, because these are impossible. It's a waste of time, money, etc. It's like running a study to see if pigs could fly. It was very, very incredible. So my understanding is that science is actually a verb. It is a process. It's a very methodical, structured process to answer research questions. There is no limit to the research questions that you can be curious about. And so we were incredibly surprised by this response. It's definitely given a food for these conversations about taboos and obstacles and fear about these phenomenon that so many people experience.
Well, it's one thing to reject your research. It's another thing, like the clerics in the time of Galileo, to not even want to look into the telescope. It sounds
That's
like
right.
you look into the telescope. So
and you can sorry.
No, go ahead.
You can even go further, because if someone's worldview is so entrenched, even when they look in the telescope, they can't see. It's like they literally block themselves from seeing what's right in front of them. There was some story about the Wright brothers when the airplane, they were learning how to create the airplane, and people they literally couldn't see it because it just did not fit within their worldview.
Yeah, didn't some scientists come out and say this is why this could? In other words, the Wright brothers had already flown, but then there was a lot of fake news that said, no, that never happened because scientifically it's impossible.
Right. And it's like, oh, but there it goes. So how do you explain that? The models are obviously incomplete.
Right. There you go. Well, let's talk just about a few of I really want to talk about the interconnectedness and the collective consciousness. I'm going to get to that, but there are so many studies that you and Dean Radin and others at IONS have been performing that really are mind-blowing. We talked about the mind-blowing nature of life, death, and consciousness here at this Unity Spiritual Life Center. But let's talk about a couple, some of your favorite. I mean, I could go into some of the RNGs or some of the precognitives. What are some of the more favorite ones that demonstrate the fruits of this one mind that we talk about?
There's so many to choose from. I'll start with one that I really love. It's a protocol called the Distant Mental Intention of Living Systems. So imagine that, or DMILS for short. Imagine that you and your friend, you're really close, you decide to participate in this study. you go to the laboratory and you sit in a room in front of a closed caption TV monitor. Your friend goes across the building into a different room. Both of you are hooked up to electrodes that collect your brain waves, your heart waves, what's happening with your skin, etc. And then you are instructed to, every time you see your friend's face on the monitor, to send them positive intentions. And when their picture goes away, you stop. And you repeat that cycle over and over again. So then we gather all of the physiological data from both of you and look at how that shifts from when you're sending intention to when you're not. And there is a dramatic difference. And your your friend's physiology changes when you're sending compared to when you're not.
At that exact
moment, even though they're separated, different part of the building, electromagnetically shielded chambers, et cetera. To me, that is absolutely incredible. And that's been repeated in multiple labs all over the world. The body is an amazing, amazing vehicle.
Truly it is. And the random number generators work that you folks have done, and I think some in conjunction with the Global Consciousness Project. I mean, we've talked about it here, and I think you folks know the story, but very briefly, the random number generators. Actually, Helené, why don't you please tell folks what the random number generators are? You can tell them better than I can, and why it's so important, and how we've conducted experiments around the world. Then we'll get to 9/11. But go ahead.
So they're random number generators. Let's call it a target. It is a target that has been used for decades of our intention, our mental intention being directed against this target. Parapsychology researchers have been trying different targets over the years. And this idea of having random probabilistic systems as a target increased a few decades ago. And so these random number generators are essentially electronic devices that generate, just to put it simply, zeros and ones in equal amount. So 50-50, zeros and ones, and it happens totally randomly. And for the most part, there's nothing that can make those deviate. So after you look at this whole length of data, there should always be an equal number of zeros and ones. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been numerous studies that have been done in the laboratory where people direct their intention towards these devices and the data shifts, either more ones or more zeros. And there's not a really good explanation for this, in my opinion, besides that our intention has some effect. Now, there's so many nuances and lots of theories about how this works exactly, but we've demonstrated that effect over and over and over again. Now, that protocol I just described in the lab, random number generator, one person directing, is very different from the Global Consciousness Project. Mm-hmm. Now, and the reason it's different is because in the laboratory, the person sitting there knows that they are specifically, intentfully directing their intention towards this thing. The Global Consciousness Project has multiple random number generators all over the globe, and it's just constantly collecting data. And perhaps some of us who know about it may be directing our attention to it, but for the most part, we're just going about living our lives. Mm-hmm. And the Global Consciousness devices collected data for over 20 years and found very statistically significant effects when they looked at 500 different events. And there's so many lessons in that project that I think are quite fascinating.
These are generally galvanizing events like 9/11, like the death of Princess Diana, et cetera. So, rather than going into all the minute details of that, it really starts to demonstrate just how powerful our intention is. So we're talking about prayer, for other people, or setting our intention before this course, asking you folks to set your intention as well. How valuable that is, and now how valuable that is in relationship to scientific proof.
Absolutely. I mean, we see over and over again that intention matters. One lesson from the Global Consciousness Project that I thought is quite fascinating is that the data was significant, whether it was a positive event or whether it was a negative event. So that polarity didn't really matter. It was this kind of emotional charge. But in other studies, we see how intention matters, intending that chocolate makes you feel better, or tea makes you feel better, or intention on cells in vitro, or plants, or people, or animal models for healing, for learning. And learning, actually, there have been studies where people direct their intention to students, and those students do better on tests. So there's many studies that are showing these significant effects. Now, those effects are small. So they're in the 0.15 to 0.25 range, which is kind of on the smaller end. A behavioral intervention might be about 0.25, 0.3. So some people say, oh, well, they just write it off. And they say, well, the effect is so small. But we keep seeing it over and over and over again in many different labs around the world consistently. And we get to pool that data and see the strength of that evidence.
So here's the $64,000 question, Dr. Wahbeh, although that's not much money these days, right? Back in the 50s. But here it is. I mean, all of these things are titillating, they're interesting, they're fascinating. When we did the One Mind series last fall, it was like, wow, the universe is a lot broader. We're more interconnected than ever. What real effect does it have on our lives on a day-to-day basis, especially since we're living in a time with what some people call existential crises? We got some problems in our country. There's concern about our republic. Sometimes we like to relegate our spirituality to one silo and our real life to another. And yet we're talking about the collective consciousness and interconnectivity, which is one of your specialties. So give us some insights and maybe some hopes for the times that we're living in right now.
Absolutely. So channeling, like I mentioned, I feel is a capacity of all humans, and it allows us to tap into our intuitive, noetic wisdom to really help us discern the next best steps for us in our own individual lives. There have been numerous studies showing that channeling is good for you, that people have increased meaning, increased quality of life, and receive benefits from the process of channeling. That's on an individual level. You take it one step further. Could we perhaps gain information that might support humanity with these intractable problems that we're facing that we as humans don't have access to, but perhaps tapping into a higher, wiser, and more empowered source might offer us solutions? So that's one aspect that I think it's really important to include channeling in the conversation. The second is about, if I really, truly embody this concept of interconnectedness, then my ability to hate, to demean, to ostracize, I feel becomes diminished. And the conversation becomes less about us and them, less blaming, less judging, less finding what's different, to more about what is our common ground. Maybe we actually all just want the same thing, and the way we're trying to get there looks very, very different. It invites us to see ourselves in the other and work more diligently to find solutions that can support the whole. Because you can't exclude the other. If we're all interconnected, you can't say, okay, I don't like what they're doing, I'm just going to put them over there. because you're intrinsically interconnected, you can fool yourself in thinking that they're over there, but they really aren't. So why not? I have another funny suggestion that would be really amazing if it happened someday. What if, whatever blocks us from truly experiencing this interconnection on a very real practical level just disappeared? What if tomorrow I woke up, I could hear everybody's thoughts, I could feel everybody's feelings? I feel that would be a trial by fire, but would really refine our impeccability with our thoughts, with our actions, with our deeds. If I knew what everyone was thinking around me, it would make it very clear what was going on. No lying, it would be completely transparent. And you'd have to clean up your act very, very quickly.
And well, maybe this is, we talk about, I think you'd have to agree that perhaps on the verge of a major shift in consciousness. Maybe that's what it looks like.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that's happening naturally in not such an extreme way. But, since COVID and people being quarantined in their homes, et cetera, there was so much more introspective action and people just really wondering, who am I? What's my meaning in life? And being more interested in these topics. I actually just wrote a small editorial about how people are searching these topics out. IONS has increased their membership. Our webinars have thousands of people on them. Similar organizations are getting many more people interested in these topics.
We have a question from the audience.
So here's my question. You were talking before, I found that very fascinating to hear about how people who had a different mindset couldn't even see what was right in front of their eyes. So how do we get past this sense that there are some of us who really want to do this consciousness work, who perhaps are sending our intentions out into, to others, right? To create this field of unity and oneness. But then there are others who are very set in their ways or closed off. They're basically living in another reality and not open to that. How does that get sorted out? I mean, even in your case where you've had other scientists who, they're out to get you now because, you're on a different wavelength than them, literally. So I think that's where the frustration is, that in unity in particular, we talk about shifting our consciousness. But we're looking for some sense of hope that by shifting our consciousness, that actually will have impact on others who are very resistant to anything like that.
Yes, that's a beautiful question. And I deal with this all the time. And when I was first at IONS and I received, this really intense negative feedback, I felt impelled to just need to engage with them and talk to them and convince them, no, look at this, look at that, look at this, look at that. And I found very quickly that there's some people who are just completely closed. And I could, give them a pile of evidence to the ceiling and it wouldn't matter. And I personally made the choice to love them and let them go and say, great, when you're ready, I'm here and I'm happy to share. And I don't give them a whole lot of time or energy. And again, I talk about spectrums a lot, right? So here's the spectrum. Those people are extreme over here. And I just, love them and make resources available and don't worry about them. And then you have the people over here who are just completely on the bandwagon no matter what. And they really could care less about the science because they've had their direct experiences and they're on board. The people who are really our audience, who are my audience, are in the middle. They are, a little open, a little curious. They don't really know about the studies, but they're open to hearing about them. And honestly, that is a big part of the spectrum, that the extremes are there, and they're often really loud, that it seems like there's a lot of them, but there aren't. And I just don't spend my time or energy focusing on them. And I focus on this middle section. We
Fabulous.
just Yeah, we just got a paper published in the Frontiers of Psychology, which is a mainstream journal, which we're thrilled about. And it was all about theories of consciousness. And we wrote that paper in a very specific way to just put a little wedge in the door, because we started with all the, materialistic theories. And then we said, well, what if, this other situation was happening? And we introduced the other theories, and it's had almost 16,000 views now. So for us, that is a huge win. And, we had a couple of people email us and say, well, why didn't you talk about all of these more extreme psi phenomenon? And we said, we purposefully did this to just open the door, this little crack. And that's the work that I do every day.
That's a great strategy. Thank you so much. That gives me a lot of hope, the way you described that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wahbeh. That's what we want. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for hope from the scientists as well. And I think you say that one of the hopeful signs is if more and more people come out and talk about channeling, not be so reticent to be out there and talking about what others have called woo-woo for so many decades.
Absolutely. I mean, the surveys show us over and over again that, between the lowest are about 30%, up to 90% of people who are polled. These are like huge studies with tens of thousands of people around the world are having these experiences, various experiences from, telepathy, precognition, precognitive dreams, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. So many of these experiences people are having, but they're afraid to talk about them. And so I would have numerous people emailing me or coming up to me saying, thank you so much. I had this experience and I can't tell anyone about it. But if everyone's not telling anyone about it, they feel alone. They feel like they're unusual in the experiences they're having, and they're actually really not. It's actually incredibly common.
This question is, and again, you folks have a chance to ask any question of Dr. Wahbeh that you'd like within reason. But here's one from me, and it's a bit of a loaded question. It's a bit of a Rorschach test. Answer it any way you'd like, Dr. Wahbeh. Is there a veil that's lifting? What is that veil?
Oh, that's a great question. So we can answer that in two ways. Is there a personal veil that we somehow, because of our ego personality, our ability to access this human capacity? I can't speak to that definitively. It feels intuitively, just this is Helané speaking, not scientist speaking, that there is, and that it is loosening, because I do see more and more people waking up, if you will, to their potential, waking up to this felt sense that they are more than what they believe themselves to be in the past, and that feels like it is accelerating.
Well, it's interesting, again, since we're in Edgar Cayce's backyard, and Pat Robertson for that matter. I have to bring the two up together because we love to span the spiritual spectrum here in the coastal Virginia area. But Cayce talked about in this century of humanity evolving into the fifth root race. And I'm not exact, and I've read the Cayce readings, not as much as some other folks have. I don't think anyone's come up with anything definitive, but it does talk about some sort of natural evolution of being able to tap into what we would call psychic powers, awareness powers, powers of expansion of consciousness that we're currently not tapping into. What of that?
Yes, this is a common theme amongst many channelers and mediums. We did a really fascinating study with 5 full trans-channel mediums in Mount Shasta, and we did a big qualitative analysis of the content that came through. And that was a very common theme, this awakening of humanity, this evolution from the 3rd dimension into the 5th dimension. And you see, there's channeled content saying this similar thing all over the place. how do we test that? So, my personal spiritual self can perhaps meditate and feel into that. As a scientist, I wonder, well, how can I actually test that? Is there a way for us to measure that in some way?
So maybe this, the existential crises, or what we see as existential crises, perhaps this hyper divisiveness is here to teach us something? Question mark.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is a mirror. It is showing us our shadow. It is showing us the deep, dark muck that we need to own as part of ourselves.
So a catalyst of sorts. This
Yeah.
is this divisiveness is a catalyst.
Absolutely. And it is an opportunity for growth. So do I want to stay in victim tyrant mentality or us them mentality, or do I want to rise above that? There's a great visual that has inspired me and brought me hope. And if you envision a glass of water and the water appears very clear, but at the bottom of the glass is a bunch of mud. So, you don't want to drink that water. It has mud in it, but it looks clear on the top. So, and then you envision pouring in beautiful crystal clear water. Well, that's going to stir up the mud, and the water is going to look worse. It's going to look all murky and dark and disgusting. But if you keep pouring in that beautiful crystal clear water, eventually you'll have this lovely glass of water with no mud at the bottom. I think we are in the mucky mud right now, where the clear water may be poured in, but it just looks really ugly from the outside.
Dr. Wahbeh, we've got one more question for you, and then we'll let you go for the evening because you've been here with us longer than we had asked you to. So this is from John in New Jersey, a pragmatic, consequential question. He says, I agree with and accept the reality of universal consciousness. Star Wars introduced us to the idea of the Jedi mind control. In your opinion, is that an aspect of universal consciousness, and can it be used for good or bad?
That's a great question. And it always comes up. If we all of a sudden became very psychic to the point where I could hear everybody's thoughts and I could also influence everyone's thoughts, there is a morality connected to that. There is an ethics in being impeccable with how we use those abilities. I don't have an answer for your question, really, but I think that it is incredibly important to think about. It's something that we talk about on our team all the time, because some of our research is looking into the genetics of psychic ability. And I believe and propose that all humans can channel in some way, but perhaps the way that I channel has something to do with my genetics. I come down from a long line of trance channelers. Does that mean I can trance channel more easily, whereas someone else couldn't? I don't have a clear answer for your question, but I think it is a very, very important one to ask, and one that we have at the forefront of our mind and continue discussing.
Well, once again, Dr. Helené Wahbeh is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Again, her book is The Science of Channeling. Love your recent articles on where science and spirituality meet, and also on the collective consciousness and our sense of interconnectedness. Dr. Wahbeh, I hope it's not the last time we get a chance to interact with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate what you're here to do.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, a very gracious thank you for Dr. Helené Wahbeh joining me today. Quick reminder, please click on like, subscribe, or comment. Again, it helps get programs like these out to people like you. For all of us here at New Thinking Aloud, for longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove, co-host Divisiveness, the other great guest hosts and volunteers here at NTA, I'm Christopher Naughton. Thanks for being here. You are the reason we're here.
I imagine that by now many of you already realize that, in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.